Hashtag You're It. I'm Amanda Malcolm, and you're listening to You're It Girl, a podcast focused on you and what propels you. Because that past, it does not define you. Your time is now, and you're it, girl. Hello, everybody. I'm Amanda Malcolm, and welcome back to You're It Girl. Today is actually a really exciting day. I was just talking to Nick Tantillo, who is the most incredible producer that puts together this entire show and podcast. He is like an audio visual specialist. Audio is his specialty, which is why we always sound so good on these mics. Yep. And I just realized that yesterday was actually March 21st, which was the official launch date of You're It Girl last year. So it has been 1 full year. So if you've been listening, I just wanted to thank you. I just realized that now. It's gone by so fast, but so slow at the same time. Yes.
A lot has happened.
A lot has happened. And so today we have a guest who is a good friend of mine. Started off as a work colleague, and we have become friends. His
Hopefully.
name is, we're friends.
Yeah, we're friends.
We're friends. His name is Charles Drown. I'll have him introduce himself, but you are the very first guest of the new season. So welcome.
I feel honored to be on the first episode of the next season.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm Charles Drown. We met through work because I'm a home inspector. I have a business. I have some employees, and we kind of talked about our lives, and we got to know each other. I am a husband of 12 years and a father of 3 beautiful girls. And
So cute.
I have done a lot of cool things in my life. I used to be a commercial fisherman in Alaska. I used to work as a maintenance engineer for Marriott properties, which is really boring compared to some of the other things I've done in my life. But I was born in California, and then I moved to Arizona in 2004. And I've lived all over the West Coast. Alaska, Montana, Idaho. But yeah, I'm here now, and I love Arizona, and I love being a home inspector. Love being a dad.
You're a great dad.
I am a good dad.
You're a great dad.
I am a good dad.
Mm-hmm. And a good husband. I've met your wife. She's lovely. Actually, the first time we met, it was at a broker open. Did you reach out to me on Instagram, or I reached out to you? I can't remember.
I probably reached out to you. I'm pretty aggressive with that stuff.
You were not aggressive. You're not aggressive, but you reached out and I invited you to a broker open, and you brought your wife. That was the first time that I met her. She's lovely. And we started talking, and we hit it off immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I scheduled an inspection with you that night or if it was a couple days later. I called you, and you've become like, you are my guy. Like, you are number one, the one that I recommend. I've trusted you with my own houses. And this isn't like a, marketing spiel, but like, he really is awesome.
I appreciate that.
And I trust you with all my clients too. So I appreciate everything that you have done for all of my clients.
Well, I try to work with this is not a marketing spiel for you either, but I try to only work with realtors that actually care about their clients.
Yeah.
And so, like, I've worked with some agents that they were pretty clearly deal oriented instead of client oriented. And I just kind of end up, not giving them priority, and they end up phasing out and using somebody else, which is a, passive aggressive way of getting rid of them.
That's okay. Whatever.
But yeah, it's been a real joy to work with you.
Thank you. Same. Charles is going to share quite a story today. And the interesting thing about the podcast, and we were just talking about this before we started the show, is ever since I started talking about this, the people that have come to me and shared similar stories has really just blown my mind. You never really know like where somebody came from and what they have overcome. But with you and I, and with so many other people that are so close to me in my life, and I'm so grateful, but there's a really interesting piece of trauma-based things where it almost feels like there's this way that we're sort of like is that a word? Synergetically? Is that a word? Is it even a word? I'm making it a word.
Synergy is a word.
Synergy, thank you. Where we seem to be somehow just naturally connected to each other. And even when we first met, it's like there was this thing about you. And I don't know if like our souls like recognize that. And then just somehow we end up in some way, shape, or form becoming like friends, colleagues, and any people that have shared these similar stories or had a similar background. Like they're more than just a colleague, you know, and you are that. And so when you started sharing a little bit of your story, as dark as some of it is, there actually was such a deep piece for me that was it's like I knew you, like I recognized you and knew so much more about you. Yeah.
We can recognize somebody else's energy.
Yes.
I think so.
Yeah. I believe it to be true. And now I definitely believe it to be true. So speaking of that, Charles is going to share a little bit about just his background, his family. You have quite a lot of siblings, as I do too. So we share that. So tell us about you. Tell us about that.
So I guess I'll start it off the way I typically tell this is like, I was raised by my grandparents. So I am third oldest. I have 2 older sisters of 12 siblings, all from the same mom and dad.
That it's rare in itself. Yeah. I have 8 all from the same mom and dad, and people are always like, what?
Yeah. They're like, are you Mormon?
Yep.
Are you Catholic?
Yeah.
I'm like, no, my parents are just crazy. That's what I always tell people. And so I was raised by my grandparents because when I was 9 months old, I was taken away from my parents by Child Protective Services in California. And I was in the foster care system for a little while, and then my grandparents got full custody of me. They never adopted me. They kept me as like a legal guardian. But I think that was mainly because they got more help from the state. They were already retired, and so they needed that help from the state. So it made sense to not just adopt me.
And this is your mom's parents, your dad's
my
parents?
Dad's parents.
Dad's parents.
Yeah. And then the rest of my siblings, well, my parents, after we got taken away from my parents, it was for child abuse. It was for physical abuse. Effectively, what I was told from my grandfather was he remembers a very specific time. I'm just going to dive right into it.
Dive in.
He remembers a very specific time while I was still in custody of my parents, where I was probably 6 or 7 months old, and my dad was he was trying to teach me not to cry, I guess, as an infant, and so he was beating me with a spoon, I think, and putting a pillow over my head and just hitting me until I stopped crying. And it was in the other room, and my granddad was witnessing it and trying to figure out what he needed to do. But I essentially just passed out. And that's when I stopped crying. So he took the pillow off my head. And then my grandfather came in and picked me up and held me, and my eyes were swollen, from crying, and face was, and my granddad says, one day this is going to be my kid. I'm going to raise this kid. And so shortly, it was a few months after that, we got Child Protective Services got custody of us. I was 9 months old when I was taken away from
And your sister, you had 2 older sisters.
Yeah, my oldest sister was 4, I think. And then the middle sister, my other older sister, she was like 2 or 2.5, because we're 15 months apart. So she was pretty young too. And my dad would make her, my oldest sister, Anya, stand on his hand and try to balance, and she would fall off of his hand and get hurt, and then he would make her bounce. It was weird. My dad was crazy. So when he was 19, he was working in construction, and he fell off a fourth story scaffold and landed, I think it was on concrete or asphalt, on his head, and his skull was fractured and broke both of his arms, and he was in the hospital, but he recovered, but not mentally. And I think he was kind of eccentric and fun, and everyone described him as this fun, artsy, like eccentric guy, but then I think there was just a part of him that, really changed.
That was broken and never healed.
Yeah.
We had an episode that Claire Spencer was on, and we were actually talking about psychopaths on the episode, but she was talking about a world-renowned like psychotherapist that has analyzed like the brains of psychopaths basically, and saying that there is always some sort of trauma that happened, like some sort of head injury that relates to like honestly, like just some sort of like connection that is like no longer made, and they're just different from that point forward. And for the most part, it almost always is some sort of head injury that happened at some point in adolescence. I mean, who knows? We won't know. There's no excuse for any of that, but
yeah, I mean, that certainly seems like a good excuse though, right? As you crushed your skull. I mean, obviously everything that happens afterwards, it's tragic, but it's it was growing up, with my living with my grandparents, he would like call us on the phone and be like, I don't know if I've told you this.
No, I don't think so.
He would,
I didn't know this story either.
So he would, so after we were taken away.
So who was, so both of your sisters and you?
Yeah, they got
so your
all three of us.
grandparents had three of you.
Yeah, crazy, right? They were in their late 50s and they had an infant and a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old who had abuse.
Severe.
Yeah, and so we like, the older girls went to counseling. We all had our ways of acting out because I know, I felt some abandonment because I didn't have my parents, and my sisters, could remember some of their abuse. So they had that trauma that they were working through as little kids. And my grandparents grew up in a totally different generation. My granddad was a cattle rancher, and he was like, if you fall off the horse, you get back on the horse, you just shake it off. And it's a good mentality to have, but not always ideal for dealing with, sensitive situations like that. But yeah, we were with our grandparents, and my parents, my dad really, my mom was just kind of at the will of my dad. She has her own trauma, but they wouldn't do what was required to get us back through the state of California. They had to, do certain checkups and do all this stuff. And so my dad wouldn't have it. He wouldn't do it. So they just moved away. They moved to Alaska, to Prince of Wales Island in the middle of nowhere, and had 9 more kids. And
in Alaska?
In Alaska. Yeah. So my brother, who works for me, he grew up in Alaska, and I didn't meet him until I was 14.
Wow. Was there any contact really with them once they moved away?
Yeah. So they would call, like, that's where I was going with that, was they would call us maybe a couple times a year and just be like, hey, how you doing? I would talk to all my siblings, and I'd be told if, when a new sibling was born and, what their name was. And that was, and then my parents, I remember when I was pretty young, I was like 5 or 6, my dad would be like, yeah, we know this guy who's a hitman, and he offered to take out your grandparents and then bring you guys back to Alaska with us. But I told him no. And it was just like this weird, like, yeah, it was like,
tell a 6-year-old that.
Well, I don't know. It was just like this weird thing. And it was always something like that. And then my granddad would hear about it, and he'd be like, okay, you guys aren't allowed to call anymore. But my grandmother was so forgiving and so willing. She really felt bad for him. She had a lot of empathy for my dad. And so my grandfather would most of the time just break contact from them and not let them call us. And then they'd wear down after a year or two, and then we'd get another call. And so that was what it was like pretty much until I met them when I was 14.
And what about your other siblings?
What
was going on with them? Did you hear about anything, or did you know, or?
So I didn't know anything really until I got to meet them. And then, so when I met them, I was 14. David was 12 at the time.
So
And
he was born shortly after you.
Yeah.
After you were taken away, they had it
Yeah, they just kept having
pretty
kids.
quickly.
I think actually what happened is the reason why they left to Alaska is because my mom was pregnant with David, and they didn't want him to be taken away too. So that's why they moved. So when I met them, they were, they were awesome. I mean, they're my brothers and my sister. And so it was really cool to meet them, and our genetics are super strong. So we instantly had that like connection, and we had the same silly humor. And, but we had contact on and off with them. They had moved from Alaska down to Oregon, and we had contact on and off between 14 to 17 years old for me. So 3 years. And I actually went and lived with them for at least a month. I think it was closer to 2 months, just because I was like in between living with my grandparents and moving in with my cousins who kind of took care of me. When I was living with them, my dad would always keep a couple of the kids with him while he was off to work, or anytime he went anywhere, he'd keep a couple of the kids with him. He would never go anywhere solo. And later I learned that was because he didn't want my mom to run off with all the kids.
Oh,
so
interesting.
if he had a kid, he always had a hostage, so she could never get away from.
Because she wouldn't leave them behind.
Yeah, she wouldn't leave one of her kids. So my dad anyway, the boys would tell me, they'd be like, hey, dad hits us with like 2x4s or with pipes, metal pipes. And, I grew up where I was raised by my grandparents. Our grandparents spanked us, and they disciplined us. Sometimes they use a wooden spoon or whatever.
Yeah.
And I know people don't always agree with that method of discipline, and I could respect that. But it didn't really, I never felt abused.
It was a different time then. It was. I was spanked.
Yeah. I'm actually thankful that, I look back at how disrespectful I was to my grandparents, and I think maybe I deserve more.
You deserve a little spanking.
But anyway, I didn't really take it seriously when they told me that. I was just like, and then I never saw it when I was living with them.
Did your grandparents ever tell you anything about the circumstances of you being removed? They did.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. But it wasn't like it was with my brothers, because we were so young.
Yeah. Yeah.
So and then when I lived with them for a couple months, I never firsthand saw it, other than like put your nose in the corner and stuff like that. It was like really mild. They lived in extreme poverty. My dad was very lazy, so he didn't work hardly at all. They lived in a trailer that he kind of negotiated to live in, like a single wide, or maybe it was a double wide.
With a lot of kids in there.
With a lot of kids, 9 kids, 2 to a bed. And we would go like dumpster dive for food, and go to like places that were going to throw away their food, and they give it to us and stuff. But they also had like goats and chickens, and it was a really interesting experience. And then they came to me. This is when I was 17. They came to me at my grandfather's funeral, because we met there for the funeral. And they're like, hey, we need help. Dad is like, we need help. Dad is beating us. And at that time, I just like did not have the mental capacity to like acknowledge that they actually needed help. And I was grieving my grandfather's loss, or the loss of my grandfather. And I didn't take it seriously. So they ended up going to a rabbi, because they were practicing Jews at the time. and they went to a rabbi that they were really close to, and essentially told him the same thing. And he was like, well, we need some kind of like evidence. And so,
Isn't this crazy?
well, they needed, I mean,
Yeah, you have
if we're going to take this seriously, we need some kind of proof.
Yeah.
Because my dad is like really manipulative.
Charismatic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even with his like grungy appearance, because he had a big long beard and, anyway.
Seems nice.
He could seem super nice, very polite, very fun to talk to, but he's like Charles Manson, like manipulative kind of thing. Maybe not quite that bad, but he's pretty manipulative. And so, I mean, I lived with him for 2 months and I didn't see anything that warranted that. Right.
They probably felt so safe having you there for 2 months.
Yeah. So they went to the rabbi. He wanted some proof. And I think it was David or one of the kids, one of the older boys, recorded an audio recording of my dad beating my sister, who was probably 7 at the time, with a fiberglass tent pole, like a piece of a fiberglass tent pole. And you could hear audible like hits. And I can't remember if it was 40 or 80 audible hits on that recording, but it is public record. So I don't care to look it up, but you could hear the recording, and it was on the internet for a while, because once that came out and they got arrested, it was like national news. It was all over the news because these crazy religious psychopaths with a bunch of kids were beating all their kids, and it made great headlines. And everyone was in our family's business for, a week or whatever, till some moved on to the next thing. But then there was a court case. All the kids testified. I testified.
Oh, all the kids testified.
Yeah, all the kids, all the older ones for sure. Maybe not.
It takes a lot of courage.
Yeah. My mom pled not guilty.
What was your mom's involvement? Did she
was
participate
active,
or
she participated in some of the abuse. Yeah. And I have a lot of empathy for my mom. I know that my dad was horribly manipulative and he held the kids hostage. So that's like, I couldn't imagine being in that situation. And to punish her, he would drag her around by her hair, or make her strip down naked and stand in like a pond in front of the kids for like hours and do like really horrendous things, humiliating things. But unfortunately, she also participated in some of the abuse of the children, hitting them with various instruments. And I think it's taken her a long time to realize that she was a victim, but she was also part of the problem. And I know at one point she tried to run away with us before all my siblings were born. And she got in trouble for that. And so that may have dissuaded her from trying again. But yeah, it's part of the reason probably my dad kept one of the kids with him all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty wild. So I think that's pretty much the summary of it. My mom got 20 years in prison because she pled not guilty and she was found to be guilty. And then my dad got 30 years, which everyone thinks is a really extreme sentence. But in the state of Oregon, at the time, it was 5 years per count of child abuse. And so he had 9 children. So my mom getting 20 years and my dad getting 30 years seemed to be lenient from that standpoint. And I've visited my mom. I haven't visited her since I had kids, which I feel really bad about. But I visited her at least once a year until I started having kids. And then when I had Audrey and I was holding her in my arms and she was like 9 months old, I had this like moment where I was just like, how could anyone beat or do this to this precious baby? And I thought I was like totally over it. And I thought I had like worked through all that emotion.
Yeah.
And then I was like holding her and I was just like, wow. It made it so
It puts it
real.
into perspective. You're holding your own child. Yeah.
Yeah. That was rough. So
I could see why that would be difficult to visit them. Yeah.
Yeah. And it took my mom a long time in prison to even admit that she was at fault at all. It's like, well, Mom, you did have some involvement.
Yeah.
I mean, you did hit the kids with boards and with pipes. And you didn't. And I mean, you could argue, well, I'm fearful of your dad. And that may be true. But I mean, you could have told somebody. The kids had to tell somebody, you know. If she had told that rabbi instead of my 15-year-old brother, she would have been the hero of that story instead of the perpetrator.
Right.
So
What about your dad? Have you visited him?
I have not visited him. Well, last time I talked to him, I called him to tell him that my grandmother, his mom, had passed away. Yeah. And he sent me some letters, but he's crazy. And so he'll write you a letter that's like, 20 pages long, handwritten. And it's like about biblical prophecy from his perspective and, all this, it's really bizarre stuff. And then he sent me like, he started running out of room in his cell. And so he sent me a bunch of like his notes and like books that he had marked up. And so, I should visit him. I've thought about visiting him. He's getting older and I would feel sad to not visit him before he died because he'll probably end up dying in prison. If not, he'll be very old when he gets out.
How old are they?
So my mom is in her 50s.
And she has another how many years?
She's been in since 2007. And my dad is in his 60s.
Okay.
Yeah. I couldn't give you the exact dates.
They have a while to go. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
I feel bad that I don't know how old my parents are.
It's all right.
They're not.
Sometimes I can't remember how old I am.
Yeah. Do I know how old I am? I told somebody the other day I was 31. I was like, that's not right.
That's not all right.
No.
Well, sometimes I'm like, am I 38? Am I going to be 38? Like, I don't really, you kind of just, I don't know. Just it's not. It's irrelevant.
Yeah,
it's irrelevant.
After 21, I don't think your birthday matters at all.
No, except for our kids. Like it's a big deal. It's a big deal.
Yeah. So yeah, I think, I feel like because I was one of the youngest, other than my three youngest siblings who got adopted by a lovely family, and I just saw Jacob the other day. He came and visited. I feel like I was actually one of the ones that received the least amount of trauma because I was so young when I was taken away and I was raised by totally awesome grandparents. And so the fact that I've had to work through any type of like abandonment or, like I was getting choked up talking to you about this just a minute ago. And it's like, I can't imagine all my siblings have kind of dealt with it in different ways.
Once they were all, once your parents went through trial and then put in prison, what happened how are they all
Great question.
Dispersed?
So because they were part of like a Jewish community, they got pretty much all adopted or put into foster care within that Jewish community. So pretty much which was awesome because they all stayed together in Salem, Oregon. Except for the three youngest who ended up getting adopted.
How old were the three youngest? Because Jacob was 16 when.
So David was. David was like 15, 16 when my parents got arrested, and Joseph, the youngest, he was like 8 months old. So it was like the whole thing over again. Yeah. Yeah. So it was like, I think it was like 8 months old. And then Jacob was, they got renamed. So it takes me a minute to be like, what's their names? Because they got, I'm sorry, guys. If you watch this ever, I'm sorry. I love you. Yeah, Jacob was probably 2, and then James was 4, something like that. Yeah.
So 3 youngest.
My little buddy. Yeah, James is in the Marine Corps now.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, this was like this is my life. But yeah, all the kids went into foster care, and then some of them got adopted. Some of them changed their last names to their. Most of them changed their last names to their adopted or family. And we all stayed connected.
I was going to ask, what's the connection with everyone? So we would come visit. We all hang out. We're at the end of the day, like we disagree on stuff. Surprising, right? Family members do that. Yeah. We have widely different views on religion, politics, how you should live your life. Well, there's 12 of you. So of course, yeah. But
we all love each other. And when we get together, it's like chaos and a lot of fun. But yeah, we stayed together throughout, we would come visit. I would come visit the kids at least once a year. And then one of the kids would come down and visit us down here. John lived with me for a while. David lived with me for a while. We've always had our door open. Like if anyone wanted to come live with us or visit us for a long period of time, we've always said, come on down. Mm-hmm. So it's been a lot of fun. I'm the oldest of the 9 boys. So that's
a lot of boys.
Yeah, it's a lot of boys. Yeah. And now I'm a girl dad, right? It's so it's like this weird, I've had to switch roles there, but and I can't speak for my siblings on this. And I know they went through some horrendous dealings, but I've talked to David about it. He's pretty open. I personally wouldn't change anything because to me, I feel like, first of all, you always think everyone has this perfect life, right? You look at people.
You and I've talked about this, yeah.
They have this perfect life, and you just don't know anything about those people. It's true. And
especially when they see, you look at you, for example, and we talked about this just before we started. You're an entrepreneur. You have a beautiful wife, 3 beautiful children. Like you enjoy travel. You're always doing these amazing hobbies. Like when you look at you just dressed up, sitting in this chair right now, like it seems like everything is perfect. You were probably, because you're like this now, you were probably came from, perfect all-American family. That's in our mind what you kind of assume.
Yeah. And I think it's people have done that with you too. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just lazy thinking. People just want to jump to a conclusion, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I think it's important to be like, hey, I have a story and this is a part of me, but this isn't all of me. And I've told my brothers this, like, at some point in your life, you need to take responsibility for you and stop putting it on your parents or whoever caused you this trauma, right? Because it's like, let's say in our instance, right? I can just speak for our situation. For David, who lived through the most of it, he dealt with it for 15 to 16 years, right? So at what point are you now going to take responsibility for your actions? Is it 16 years after when you've been doing it on your own? There's got to be a point where you have to say, okay, now I'm responsible for me, right? So figuring out, that's just a part of me. That's not who I am. And, I was told for a long time, like, oh, you're going to end up just like your dad.
Who would even say that?
I had like anger stuff.
Oh, yes.
And people would get upset with me and be like, oh, you're going to end up just like your dad. And I was just like, in the back of my head, like, I didn't let that in the moment show that it fazed me. But like in the back of my head, I was like, that's the last thing I want to be. And so, but like just recognizing like, hey, I'm in control of me now. I'm not going to let that control me for the rest of my life. I think that's really important to like be like, okay, well, that sucked. Now what am I going to do?
Right.
Yeah. It's been and you asked me, you're like, to come on here, and I told you, I was like, I'm not like, I wouldn't say that I'm 100% over my, I haven't totally gotten over what happened in my childhood or to my, I have such a weird, awkward conversation every time I talk about my parents. I have this awkward conversation where it's like, my parents aren't really my parents. They're actually my cousins, because I call my cousins who raised me from like 14, 15 to when I moved out. And my real parents are in prison. And I have 11 siblings, and they all have different last names, and they all live all over the country. And it's like,
it's such a story for people. Like, it's too much to digest.
And I've heard people talking about it, like, be wary of somebody that like just dumps all their like,
I know,
all that information on it. But like, I'm just an open book. So forgive me for being just open about stuff.
It's funny sometimes how, and I've developed sort of this story that I just naturally kind of say too. And most of the time it's just, oh yes, I'm one of, 7 siblings. Yeah. My dad lives in Illinois. My mom is here. And everyone's like, are you close? I'm like, yeah. I mean, because sometimes if I unload it, you can just tell by the look on somebody's face that it's just, it's so much to be able, one, to be able to like take in general, just the whole amount of siblings and just the story. But then like the traumatic piece of it is just a lot of times just too much to unload. And so I keep it surface, but then I've had people call me out on it where they'll be like, oh yeah, Amanda, like you just made that sound like that was all so good and positive. I'm like, I know, but you just got to give people sometimes what they're able to digest.
Yeah. You want to get into it every time you talk to somebody.
Every time. Yeah. I remember last year, I think it was sometime in the summer, I was visiting some friends, and I actually was having a voice conversation with a guy that I was like interested in. We were exchanging voice memos back and forth. And the guy had said, oh my gosh, it sounds like your childhood was so amazing. Like just saying all this stuff. And my friend looks at me and she goes, does he know about your actual childhood? I'm like, that would be a little too much, just right up front. Just kind of put that out there.
Listen to the podcast.
Share the happy moments. I mean, I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer to that, but.
Yeah, I was like, I heard somebody saying that, like, oh, be wary of, or be.
They call it like trauma dumping or something, which actually I resent. Like, if you asked, like, don't ask then, don't ask such a deep question.
Yeah, my parents are in prison. I'm like, oh, okay.
I think they just don't know what to say.
Yeah. I'm sorry. They're like, oh, I'm really sorry. It's like, it's okay.
Yeah.
Not a big deal.
I think people don't know what to say. And so the natural response is just like deer in the headlights and I'm sorry. And then it's so interesting. Like they generally won't ask any other questions, right?
Right. Yeah. A lot of times people will be like, so where do your parents live? I'm like, yeah, they live in Oregon.
There you go.
Oh, and why do you do you used to live in Oregon? Why do you have an Oregon number? The reason why I have an Oregon number, since you asked, Amanda, is because my mom didn't have long distance calling for free from prison. So I changed it to an Oregon number so it wouldn't get charged exorbitant amount of money to call me.
It's really kind of you.
And it's been great because now most spam callers call from a local area code. And so I almost
That's
have
actually, great. Naturally weeded them out.
Yeah.
Who would have thought?
Although
Be thankful for that reason.
The other day I sent a client to voicemail because it was from Oregon, and I was
Oh.
like, I thought it was a spam call, and then they like left me a voicemail. They're like, we'd like to book an inspection. I'm
like, oops.
Sorry.
Oopsies.
Yeah.
So what has been the most difficult part of this to overcome as you became a parent?
Actually, raising your kids is very difficult, right? And seeing your kids grow up and experiencing all the things. And it's like, it was extremely hard for me to see all of my babies, holding all of my babies when they were around the 6 to 8 month, 9 month mark, and thinking about, you know, laying a hand on them. You know, that was really tough for me. But then also just like, I guess being conscious of like, I don't want to end up like my dad. And so I'm like hyper analytical on like every conversation I have with my children, every time I discipline them. I'm like, I think back about how I was when I was a kid. I'm like, well, would I like that? Or would that resonate with me? And I think that's actually really valuable.
Yeah, that's a huge piece of awareness to stop from an overreaction.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or like, is this really that big of a deal?
Yeah.
Right.
That's actually a beautiful thing, because I think sometimes as parents we can lose it's a difficult job. You can lose your patience sometimes.
Oh.
But there's something that's like deeply ingrained in you to like stop and think for a quick second, which sometimes is all we need.
Yeah,
you know?
I think I don't want to knock any dog moms or dads out there, but people are like, oh, I know what it's like to have kids. I'm a dog mom or a dog dad.
It's not the same.
It's like, you can drop that dog off at the clinic or the doggy daycare. But it's just not the same. You develop so much patience, hopefully. That's really been the thing, right? It's just like, am I doing this right? And there's really no yes or no to that. It's like a ever evolving, changing thing day by day. And you think you got them figured out, and then they change, right? Like, you know.
I know. Yeah. Just when you think you have it figured out. I think I've actually just figured out like my daughter. I mean, really, she's 9 years old. And I think I've just figured out, and then she'll probably change, and then I won't have it together
pretty soon.
But literally, like ever since she was born, I'm like, there are some just things about us that are so incredibly different, like how we think and what we need. And as a parent, it's like every day you're growing along with them.
Yeah. You ever like look at your kid and be like, I see me in her there, and then they're like, where the heck did that come from?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that is not me.
That is not in my
Rolodex.
That's not in my Rolodex. No, those are the parts that are the hardest sometimes. I think being a parent is, it's like, it's easy to relate when they need something that's similar to what you would need in that moment, because you kind of know how to handle that. But it's the time periods when they have a freak out, like, or a tantrum, and you're kind of like, I've tried all the things in my Rolodex and I don't really know like what you need, especially when they can't talk. Yeah. And you're like, I like literally can't think of anything else to do like in this moment. And it can be frustrating.
Yeah. I have a lot of empathy for my wife because she deals with that. Like,
they're so little, your kids right now. They're so little.
Deals with that more than I do. I'm like just so stoked to see them at the end of the day. And she's like over it by the time I go.
Sure. Of course. It's a lot.
It's a good transfer of power when I get home. But
do any of your sisters are older, so how many of them have their own kids?
So Anya has 3. She has 2 boys and a girl. Nadia has 4 girls. And they stopped at 4 girls.
They were trying to get a boy.
Yeah. I have 3 girls, and we'll probably try for another.
You are?
Yeah, I'll probably have another kid. I would honestly, and I'm going to sound crazy for saying this, I'm going to be like my dad. I would have 12 kids if my wife could do it. I would have 12 kids
You love being a dad.
I love it. I love it.
I can always see that in your eyes when you talk about your kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were wrestling last night before bed. I got them all riled up right before bed. It was
We
awesome.
hate that.
Oh.
As a mom, I'm like, stop doing that. Like,
they still go to sleep.
Do they?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I was always like, don't get them riled up before bed. I'm gonna go nuts.
But yeah, and then none of the other siblings have kids except for, surprise, my brother James, who's in the Marine Corps, and he's 21 or 2.
Mm-hmm.
So way down the line says David, Arthur, John, Judah, Aaron, Sarah, Aaron, James. Sorry. So the name changes, screws me up every time. Anyway, James is like the third youngest. His wife's pregnant.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of cool. And he's got awesome. So crazy. He got adopted by Nick and Nick's previous wife. And then they went through a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And he kept the 3 boys.
Oh, wow.
As a single dad, and then got remarried.
Wow.
Yeah. Like that's a lot of commitment.
You guys are all very committed to each other.
Apparently. Yeah, we got good people surrounding us, a lot of support, a lot of good people.
It's actually incredible because sometimes, I mean, I struggle with relationships with some of my siblings because, and there wasn't a lot of physical abuse. Most of it was emotional and mental and like neglect type of stuff. But sometimes it's hard for us to actually have like really deep conversations. And it's something that as an adult, like I really want to try and change that, but they're all on their own. Like you said, like I feel like you do in a sense where I'm like, they had the worst of it. I didn't. Like all I had to do is most of the time just like play rescuer. They were
dealt
like
with a lot though.
Living in it. Which just being one of the older ones and not having to, I mean, my childhood was very different than theirs. Mm-hmm. So I wish for our relationships to be deeper, but I can tell even when we're talking to each other, sometimes it's hard because what I've learned now about trauma and therapy and all this since before the podcast, but now since I've released it, I've even done like a deeper dive into it. When you're taught like not to feel, it's really hard to have like relationships, even with your siblings. That's why I'm actually like, I love hearing this from you. And it's something that like, it's so inspirational to be able to hope that one day our relationships will be like that. Because even sometimes when we're one-on-one, the conversations can be a little bit exhausting because they're so surface. Like they can't go down to a level, and we don't often talk about a lot of things that happened. We just don't.
So David, who works for me, he dealt with it the most probably. And we are so different as far as like politics and religion and all that stuff. But I feel the closest to him because he's willing to open up and talk about stuff like that. Because we can just talk about literally anything. And we may think we're stupid on various topics, but the cool thing is like, he's willing to talk about and work through that whole what happened. Where some of my other siblings, they don't talk about it at all. And it's like, and we still enjoy each other, but they don't talk about it at all. Like it's like, oh, we just put that in a box, put it on a shelf, let it collect dust, and we never look at it again.
It'll come up later.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's for me and for people with trauma, that trauma dump, talking about it is really important because it's just part of it. And I think it's almost shaming people that have gone through it to say, oh, you're trauma dumping. It's like,
Yeah, I resent that.
Yeah. I don't really enjoy that. I heard that somewhere. I was just like, I'm that guy, I guess.
I'm kind of like, that's how dare you, but okay, like whatever. If that's what you need to do to make yourself feel better.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's one of the things I've learned most about this too. And so as terrible as some of this is, it actually is really helpful. And it's helpful to listen to somebody else that has gone through something that's similar or that you can relate to, and to be able to understand, like, well, what is it that helped them to overcome this thing? What is it that they do on a day-to-day basis? Because that helps me. Like, maybe there's something that you do or something that you say that will help me to be able to overcome and evolve even more, because I didn't have that tool before.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like I said, I wouldn't change a thing. And I think people that have had crazy pasts have the best stories. If you grew up I'm not knocking anyone who grew up in like a white picket fence.
Kind of would have been a little bit nice, right?
It sounds really good, right? But you have and again, this is another thing that I know a lot of people really don't like it, is when you compare somebody's trauma with somebody else's trauma.
Yeah.
Because it's like
People hate
you're putting down their
what do they say? We don't
story.
measure it. Yeah, we don't measure.
And I think there's some validity to that for sure, because everyone's experienced something and it was horrendous and it shouldn't have happened. I acknowledge that. But for me, I try to always gain perspective and be like, my life was pretty bad, or my childhood was pretty bad, or my siblings' childhood was pretty bad. But I mean, right now, there's X, right? There's kids mining cobalt in the Congo that are, essentially child slaves,
mm-hmm.
or all the sex trafficking stuff that's going on right now, which is horrendous.
Horrendous. Could always be something better. Could always be something worse.
So so to me, I'm like, okay, like I try to step back and analyze, okay, yeah, this is bad. Could be a lot worse. How do we make it better?
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, that's really all you can do. Just being like, if you just focus on it and you're just like, oh, this is who I am now, you're just letting whoever did that to you or whatever situation control you for the rest of your life. Is that how you want to live, to finish out your life?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you want to take control of your own life and say, I'm not going to let that affect me. I choose how I'm going to live the rest of my life. Because
here's the beautiful thing about that. And my brother and I joke about the white picket fence thing sometimes, because we're like, oh man, like they would have been so great, but we'd probably be little douches,
Yeah.
Like, we'd probably be like such little fuckers.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, like we'd probably have like, just be doing whatever we want, like no responsibilities. Like there are actually some, as horrible as a lot of that stuff is, like there are extreme strengths. Like I like the way that you talk about it, because yeah, you could let it control you, but there's also some incredible strengths that are instilled inside of you because of all of that shit.
Yeah.
Like, and you wouldn't have those things if it wasn't for that. So speaking of that, I mean, it's kind of putting you on the spot a little bit, but you're already in the spotlight. What are some strengths that you think are instilled in you because of that? Because I mean, I obviously we're friends, and I watch you on social media, and you created an amazing business. I know how much you care about people, how much you care about your family, your kids. Like, I mean, you're a great husband. I mean, you are always like doing something,
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a doer.
You're a doer.
I have it. On vacation, I'll be like digging a hole in the, it's like, I can't stop doing something. So, I was horribly insecure growing up, probably mostly because of my abandonment always feeling like, why did my parents leave me?
Yeah.
Why would they beat me? All this stuff. And I felt I was so insecure. I was like emo goth, like cutting my wrists.
I can't even believe that coming from you right now.
I know. It's hard to believe. People are like, oh yeah, you're probably like a jock in high school. I'm like, dude,
I kind of would have thought that.
I was like,
see, this is, you don't know.
I was homeschooled in high school, but in middle school, like I was like the loser.
I hated middle school.
I was a loser. I had some cool friends, but you know, I was so self-conscious and so unsure of everything, and such a people pleaser probably because, again, that like abandonment thing.
I feel you on that. I'm still working on that, you know. I'm
a people pleaser in my business now.
Yeah.
So that's a weakness that became a strength. There's like, I will go, and almost to my detriment. It's a strength
in business sometimes, yeah.
Almost to my detriment, I'll go and be like, I'll be fully booked with inspections, but like, I'll make it work. I'll say yes to this one.
Sometimes I feel bad because I've called you on that before, and I'm like, I really can sense like what's going on here between our dynamic. Like, he's really busy and he's really trying to get this done for me, which I do appreciate, by the way.
But you know, so that's like something that I turned into a strength, right? Though, is like, I'm going to make this work, and I'm going to make people, for my business, people pleasing is a good thing. Also doing a great job is a good thing. I think the overcoming and recognizing that I was really insecure, that has been one of the biggest things for my life in my 30s, that even in my 20s, I couldn't do it. I was still so insecure in my 20s. I was married at 21 and a lovely wife and all that, but I was still like so insecure about things. And coming through that and being like, okay, you know what? Why do I care what other people think about me? I don't know. So like, 30s have been great as far as like, for me, I've really come into, I'm comfortable in who I am. And that really shines. People can really see that when you're confident and you walk into a room, people are like, oh, so I don't know if that's something that was something from my childhood that I turned into a strength, but it was like, it was something I certainly had to overcome. And I had to really recognize that, like, oh, like, first of all, you don't have to make everyone happy, right? My circle has gotten a lot tighter. And then realizing that you have value, right? Because for the longest time, I didn't know what value I had. So realizing you have value. Once you realize you have value, other people see that value more. For my business, that's been really great. For my family dynamic too, it's been good. And hopefully my kids, you know, I always told myself, you know, my kids will just never have to experience that weirdness that I grew up with, and it's over. And that's the other thing I wanted to make that point today, that it's like a mantra that I live by, is like, this ends with me. This cycle of like, there are people that are like, we're all alcoholics. My family's been alcoholics. We're all, you know, it's just how we are. Or we're all drug abusers, or we're all this or we're that. You can just end that cycle in one generation by making that conscious decision to change, working on yourself. And once you have kids, you raise kids, and they are free from that cycle. And then guess what? They won't pass that on, and it's over. So like, that's your legacy, is your children. So like Kennedy. She's pretty awesome. She's pretty awesome. Are we allowed to say her name on the podcast?
We can say her name. She's been on a podcast episode, but with raising our children, it's so interesting. Like, you talk about the insecurity thing, because people, I never knew you in that light, right? Like, I only know you as you are now in the last like several years, but I was also very insecure, and nobody would have ever guessed that, right? But I was like inside. But my daughter is not. And so I talk about her lots of times and I would say, oh, we're so different. And people say, no, you're not. You're the same. But it's hard for me almost to wrap my head around it because I'm like, at her age, I wasn't like that. Like she is like that because of the things that, like you said, with your kids, like you're instilling in them, they see you in a certain light and that is what you're teaching them. And so that's what they're growing and learning from. And so to actually see that now, like at 9, I just lately have like stopped. I think maybe because she's just getting so much older and she's not that little baby anymore, that little girl. I just catch myself so often now, just like stopping and looking at her in awe and going like, wow, like I know people like you're doing a great job with your kids. And this is the first time where I've been like, as a mom, like I feel like despite what my mom says about me, like I know I'm doing a good job. Like because I see like the confidence level and the security in this kid. And I didn't have that when I was young, but I know that because you said you've grown into it now, I've grown into it now. My daughter sees that. And so that's what her norm is.
Yep.
And for her, it's going to put her in just such a better place, like moving forward into adulthood, not having to deal with all this like self-worth, like insecurity bullshit. And hopefully no one will rain on that parade because like I want her to be able to, I already feel like that puts her 20 steps above her mother.
Yeah.
You know?
And she'll still have stuff that she has to deal with.
Of course.
Because life is life. But you're right. She is like you now.
Now. Not then.
Which is the best. I mean, and you're still working on who you are.
I think we're going to be working on it for, till the day that,
if you're not growing,
we go to
dying.
heaven.
If you're not growing, you're dying. So yeah, I think it's cool.
Charles, we've talked only a little bit about this and I know we're on camera and like on this podcast episode, but I learned so much more about you today and I really appreciate you coming on and sharing. Like I could cry. And also I know we've talked about sometimes it's easier for girls to talk about this stuff than it is for like grown men to come on and talk about.
It's culturally unacceptable for guys to talk about their
so
their
thank
feelings.
You also for breaking that barrier.
Yeah.
Today and coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate it. If anybody wants to reach out to you, do you want them to be able to find you or no?
Oh, anyone can find me. I mean, it's pretty easy. Square One Home Inspections is my Instagram. Shameless plug there. I share everything about my life. I stay fairly non-controversial on my business Instagram. But yeah, if anyone has any questions or wants more information, I'm an open book. So yeah, you can DM me on Square One Home Inspections. The Arizona-based one. There's another one in Virginia. But yeah, happy to answer any questions or share any other stuff.
Awesome. You're the best. Thank you for coming on, Charles, for the first episode of the second season of You're It Girl.